I have a wonderful electronic invention I want you to see. It looks something like this.
Yeehaw! Larkin Rose here, and I'm now getting an opportunity to do something I actually rarely get a chance to do. I debate with statists kind of constantly on Facebook and other settings. Often it ends up being a conversation where there's an attempted back and forth exchange with some individual, and then there's noise coming from other people, and then the topic changes every 8 seconds, and it becomes a giant jumbled mess. Well, Hody Johns was nice enough to volunteer to be interrogated by me. He is a self-described minarchist. Here he is. And if the discussion today seems a little bit one-sided, that's sort of on purpose, because the whole point is I don't usually get a chance to just one-on-one, clearly, civilly, logically walk through a series of questions with somebody who believes in government of whatever size and whatever flavor, to demonstrate that it is impossible to believe in government. It is impossible to be any kind of statist, including minarchist, without being self-contradictory. So I don't just mean being contradictory to what I believe, I mean being contradictory to what they believe. And so, again, Hody graciously agreed to let me interrogate him. And so we might as well just leap right into it. Now, first of all, just to have some starting point of where the heck we are, how would you define minarchism, or sort of your position in general? Like a brief version, it doesn't have to be very detailed.
Sure. I would just say having minimal amount of government as possible, and that the government that you have is able to be controlled, able to be voluntarily agreed on and personally enforced, as opposed to one that is federally enforced or agreed upon by other people without your consent.
Okay. Now let's leap right into the specifics. I do want to keep the specifics, so instead of talking about sort of vague terminologies and concepts, start with the premise that you have your ideal government. For whatever reason, either you get to be emperor or everybody agrees with you and you get exactly the government that you wanted. And I'm going to ask you questions about how that thing functions. For starters, does it coercively tax anybody?
No.
Okay. And how does it receive its funding?
Voluntarily.
Okay, as in from donations or from exchange for services, or what?
Sure. So that's kind of where we get down to the nitty gritty of this. Now, if we're talking about my government personally, I believe in multiple governments. I don't believe in a single federal umbrella, one size fits all. I believe in that's why part of it's got to be contractual. That's why you have to say, well, I volunteer to this and somebody else can volunteer for something else. And we shouldn't be able to restrict those rights to say you have to be a part of this government or we'll kill you or something. You need to be able to free to leave. That's one of the big reasons why we're all open borders, right? So that you're able to choose what you want to do and where you want to go and what your leadership looks like. So for me personally, as far as funding that government, It should be completely voluntary. There may be a contract drawn up, but everyone in it agrees, and you can't force anyone to not agree, or they can just voluntarily not be a part of your government.
Now, is there anything that, let's say I'm in the neighborhood and this government comes into being, however, and I don't want to buy any of its services, and I don't view it as legitimate or useful or whatever. I just want to have nothing to do with it. Does anything bad happen to me if I just want to have nothing to do with it and just keep living my life as if it wasn't there?
So by and large, no, but let's go over some of the specifics real quick, because that government that I've talked about that's voluntary, that doesn't mean that there's no outside forces magically. Some people might hear what I'm saying and say, well, that sounds like a lot of the original 13 colonies. And that's possible. It's different in many significant ways, including taxation and including the fact that boundaries are physical and geological, as opposed to getting into it by contract. And so the issue that I would have is, I would say, if you're, for example, let's say you're a pedophile and you take one of the kids that's under our contract and under our protection, and our government has said that we still are able to develop policies about foreign policy, right? And so we say, if somebody abducts one of our citizens and rapes them, that we can invade their territory and get that child back, and that person can be punished or killed or whatever it is. The contract, again, is agreed upon by the people who wish to be a part of it. So if you're part of it and you're donating to that cause. Go ahead.
This is wandering pretty far off my question, because not being a kidnapping psychopath, it's just, if I'm living my life and this government comes to be and I don't want to have anything to do with it, does it make me have anything to do with it?
Sure. So long as you don't do anything weird homesteading, or if you don't rape anybody, then no, you will not be interfered with.
Okay. Wait, what was the weird homesteading? What is...
Like you build, you've talked about it before, where you like build your home around somebody else so that they can't physically leave.
Oh, okay. Like using it to trap somebody. Okay.
Right. Or cut off water or something. Yeah.
So we have this government that's your ideal, that I didn't contract with and don't need any services for. Is there anything it can do that I don't have the right to just hire somebody else to do, whether by contract, whether calling them government, or just paying somebody to do protection or plumbing or whatever? Like, does it have a monopoly? Can it stop me and anybody else from doing anything that it does?
Correct. And that's something that's important to understand about minarchists as well. That we accept governance. We don't accept involuntary governance. You're free to make your own form of governance. You're free to your own rules, essentially, whether it's within your house or within your group of people that you've voluntarily chosen. You can form your own form of governance. Now, that's not to say that what you do won't conflict, but similar to what you said, if you aren't interfering with us and we aren't interfering with you, then everything's okay.
Okay. Then since in this hypothetical, I didn't agree to anything, I have no contract with them, I didn't consent to anything, do they have a territory or a jurisdiction? Basically, do they have it at all, unless, on the individual property or people who agree to some, arrangement with them?
No. So I believe that people are entitled to their own personal properties. You can voluntarily, if you would choose, be part of like some type of collective. For example, if you want to be a part of like try to make some type of commune, and you say, well, everybody here, and it has to be 100%. So I don't want to get stuck on this. But if 100% of you say, we have these properties, we already have them. You can't like take them over or co-opt somebody else's property. But if we have these properties, we decide to stick next to each other, and we're going to take the fruits of that and put it in and share it. If it's 100% agreed upon by all of those individuals, then yes, they can do that. But you're also free to do that as well with whoever you would contract with.
Okay, so it's actual consensus and not democracy, which is good, as in like it's all the way voluntary with all the individuals.
Correct. Can I give one stipulation to that?
Sure. Just
that if you choose to establish something and say, this you sign this contract and I will abide by whatever the vote is, then you're held also to that contract. Now, you're still able to voluntarily leave if the vote doesn't go your way. But if you establish a type of governance that says, I am okay with problems being decided by a vote or by a representative, and here's how this works, as long as you've consented to that, then you can be a part of something like that. So I don't want to make this sound necessarily perfect, but at least you're in control and you knew it was a voting type of democracy getting into it. You're also free to not be a part of a democracy.
Right, and that would be true of any contract. Like, you agreed yourself into something, now you're stuck with it because you agreed.
Yeah.
Okay, so it doesn't now. To jump to one of the most important things, can this government thing, does it have any rights that I don't have?
So this is one of the criticals, and I think that this is something that's misstated a lot. And again, it comes back to that pedophile thing. Technically, what's it? Thomas Hobbes, and you talked about this with Jan when you did your debate with him. And I was a little bit unsatisfied with his kind of glazing over what Thomas Hobbes said, because he said, well, anarchy freaked him out so much that he would have accepted any form of statism. I'm a huge fan of the Leviathan as well as a fan of Thomas Hobbes, because he's somebody that said, and he did say, and it's true, that anarchy, the lives are solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. However, he also said the exact same thing about an extreme amount of government. Now, he didn't, even if you read his exact words, doesn't necessarily condone some type of democratic or even limited government or something that forces people to do certain things other than not interfere with each other. So he specifically says, it followeth that in such condition, every man has a right to everything, even to one another's body. And therefore, as long as natural right of every man to everything endureth, there can be no security to any man of living out of the time which nature ordinarily allow men to live. He goes on, and I will finish this question. Therefore, before the names of just and unjust can have place, there must be some coercive power to compel men equally to the performance of their covenants. Now, I know you heard coercive, and maybe that's your trigger word, but the performance of their covenants, so their agreements, to make good that propriety, which by mutual contract men acquire in recompense of the universal right they abandon. So actually, Hobbes is advocating a government that enforces this contract. So it's hard because there's a disagreement on what natural rights are. You and I would probably agree mostly on life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, personal property, things like that. But there is not a consensus on that. And I think that I don't want those people having a different consensus. For example, most Americans think they have a natural right to something like education or healthcare. I don't want their you and I would both understand that means you're able to conscript somebody. We see a huge problem with that. But I don't want their definition of natural rights to mess up mine. So by mutual contract, I would say I'm going to associate with these people that protect these rights and not these people that protect these. So if this pedophile who is part of our community has taken somebody against their will, and we as a community say that's against their liberty, we are going to, I guess, break your rights. Now, I don't know if you would define that as breaking somebody's rights, because for me, that's a violation of their contract. So they volunteered themselves to do it. They agreed to be part of the community. If there were benefits of the community, they took part of it, whether it be defensive or police or whatever the community he already decided on. But if he decides to be a pedophile, he needs to be held accountable to his contract. So if there is a force that is to, I guess, have additional rights, I would say they're not necessarily additional because he's already broken his contract, but generally you can't invade somebody's property unless you violate this contract. So I would say this force is able to break his rights, but it's something that he already knew by contract would happen. Does that make sense?
Sort of. Now I lost connection for a bit, so I didn't quite catch all of that, I don't think. But okay. It's still like, if I have a contract with somebody and they, rip me off, I have a right to do something about it. So it still didn't quite get to the actual question of whether somebody actually has whether people. Sorry,
I think I'm losing connection to you. Sorry, I think I'm losing connection to you. Okay, I hear you.
Okay. Did it catch up? Okay, I exist again. I don't know why I'm on the connection. I heard there was a cutoff in between. I think I got most of your answer. The thing is, it still didn't actually answer the question of whether somebody has more rights than I do, because if somebody has a contract with me, they, back out of their, don't fulfill what they need to do, then I have the right again.
Hey, Larkin, let me pop in here. Can you make sure that you have all your other browser tabs closed and things like that? It might help with this.
So, from the connection.
Your friendly neighborhood techno wizard behind the scenes.
Right click on his call.
Oh, this is frustrating.
Red
All
number.
right. Oh, I'm for
Internet issues always hits you at the wrong time, you know?
I'm not more in. Someone else need for bandwidth, and I can't really do anything about that, which is, I don't know. So, well, it looks like I exist at the moment, so really quickly ask this question. The thing is, that didn't really answer my question, because if somebody has a contract with me, then they don't get to rip me off either. So I'll basically re-ask it with the follow-up, which is, how would somebody get rights that I don't have, and a contract doesn't do it? Because somebody can make a contract with me, and then they're bound by it, or I can make a contract with somebody and I'm bound by it. So let me slightly rephrase it. Does morality apply differently to me than it does to people in your government?
So I believe, in the spirit of your question, and I'm not trying to dodge it, I'm just trying to really lay down the specifics, because I don't want someone to catch me on a technicality. I'm going to say no, flat out, that as long as we understand that contract is binding, that the results or the punishment of what happened for breaking that contract are part of something that you knew about and agreed to beforehand, those are not additional rights. That's correct.
Okay. Now, if either nobody decided to contract at all with your ideal government to begin with, or as time went by, they all said, we think your services sort of suck or something, and one at a time they stepped away from it, nothing actually, your ideal government can't do anything to even continue its own existence, right?
Yes, so this is an important part from Anarchy as well, as this competition among governments, and that's why we reject federalism generally, because we just say that a single federal rule for everybody is wrong, because not one size fits everybody, and not everybody has this consensus. So our choices are either to force a consensus, or for you to allow you to develop it on your own. You can develop it with a community of people, which most people would choose to do out of even fear or baser instincts. Like we say, oh, I'm scared that someone's going to take us over, and even some legitimate fears. I mean, like I said, look what happened to the 13 colonies when they were operating separately. And to say, hey, maybe we should get some kind of contracts going, even with colonies we disagree with, in the matter of defense, if we choose to do that. But instead of forcing that type of thing, you should be able to, it just needs to be voluntary. But yeah, you could, and this is the reason I say this is so important, is this is that capitalist competitive idea. And I don't mean to turn off the lib socks, because libertarian socialism works in this society as well. You can have your own thing if everybody chooses to voluntarily forego that property and wants to work in a horizontal measurement. But the competitiveness of it is what makes it so that the weaker governments dwindle off. The ones that choose, even if you voluntarily choose to give up too much of your rights, people say, I'm not going to choose that anymore. I'm not going to do that. Or if taxes get crazy or something, they say, well, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to do that. And again, voluntary taxation. But you see what I'm saying.
Okay. Well, here's a fairly huge, important question. Based on your own answers, your ideal government doesn't have a monopoly, can't tax, doesn't have a jurisdiction, doesn't have any rights I don't have, which means it doesn't have any authority. Why are you calling it government?
So, and this is one of those unfortunate distinctions, because I have run into several anarchists, and Friends with a lot of them, especially after the last group. There was like, man, I really liked what you had to say, but I hate the fact that you want my enslavement. And I'm like, man, you just have this misunderstanding of what minarchy is, and as Max Stirner and William Godwin, they talk about anarchy, and it's this abolition of all rules, not just in government, but in society. Godwin was especially into abolishing the family. He believed that orchestras were wrong because they were coercive, because you could fire somebody and that was wrong. He was against trade, that because these are enforced with rules. Anarchy means no rule, right? No ruler without nobody ruling you. So the issue is that there is rules in this minarchist society. They're just rules that you've agreed upon. And so that's what makes it different than anarchy.
Except anarchy does not mean no rules. It means no ruler. A ruler being an authority who coercively controls people. That's what it means. But if here's the reason I act, like, you can sort of call it semantics, like, well, I want to call my sandwich a giraffe. Like, okay, that's fine. Why is it that you are against anarchy when what you just described is anarchy with the wrong label put on it? Like, you described a government that has none of the distinguishing factors that make it government. It has no jurisdiction, no special rights, no territory, no monopoly, no right to tax, no right to legislate, no right to do anything other than what normal people can contractually do on an individual basis. Why would you be against anarchy when you just described anarchy as your ideal?
So I don't want people to think I'm even necessarily against anarchy, because like you said, this is going to come down to a matter of semantics. This is going to come down to, after the debate, I had plenty of people, our first debate, plenty of people telling me that I was trying to conscript their death and trying to enslave them. And me, by virtue of being a minarchist, I'm their sworn enemy. And so apparently some of the things that I said, just because I would allow people to voluntarily have rulers, or rules, that all of a sudden that I am conscripting them, or if I'm enslaving them, or I'm against them. So really the majority of why I don't call myself an anarchist is because anarchists say I'm not an anarchist. Because of this is the reason I brought up Stirner and Godwin, because I reject those flat out. I say if that's what anarchy is, I reject that. Now, if you reject that, then we've got something to talk about. I mean, do you believe that families should be able to have a structure that people can voluntarily be in an orchestra together?
Yeah, obviously. Those guys are just idiots. And for them to pretend they have the right to decide that for the rest of society necessarily requires a ruling class, because most of society isn't going to go along with that stupid view. But I'm not them and you're not them, so they're not really related to this discussion. The thing is, I can tell you why anarchists are saying you want their enslavement, because you call what you advocate government, and government necessarily means coercive control. You're trying to stick the label on something that isn't that. You're trying to stick the label on anarchism, because if you're just talking about voluntary contracts that nobody's forced into, nobody has to do, you can do it if you want to, that is anarchism. And the reason some anarchists are saying you want their enslavement is because if you advocated anything that actually fits the definition of government, you would want their enslavement, because government means the exercise of authority, which is the right to rule, not the right to make contracts with other people, because everybody has that. So again, I'm going to ask you, how do you distinguish this thing that you call government from me hiring somebody to, like, either protect my property or mow my lawn? Like, if there is, here, let me do a preliminary question. Do you agree that if there is no difference between A and B, then it's sort of silly to insist that A deserves one label and B deserves another label, and they shouldn't be mixed?
I think you can have two words for the same thing. I mean, we have a lot of those synonyms in the English language, but yeah. Yes, if they're essentially the same, I agree that there's no reason to call them anything different. Okay,
so for your government to be government and to be different than not a government, there has to be some quality it has that distinguishes it from not a government. What I advocate is people be free, they can make contracts, they can make deals, they can choose not to. Basically what you described, can you tell me what's the secret ingredient that makes what you want government when what I want is anarchism and a lack of a ruling class.
Sure. So there's two answers to this. One is just the dictionary definition. Governing is conducting the policy, actions, and affairs. Now, if I was a true anarchist, I would say, well, I'm saying not anarchist. If I'm just against all government, I would say I'm against whatever the definition of government is, which is conducting policy, action, and affairs. I'm not against that because I think people can voluntarily choose to conduct their policies, actions, and affairs, right? So that's one is the definition. That's why I'm not against government, simply because it doesn't say coercive power. It may tend to be. That happens sometimes. That's why I am a minarchist, because I absolutely loathe what the state does. And I hate that so much of it is involuntary, non-mutual. I don't have to tell you about the evils of government. You already know already. But, I loathe all of that. But it's not just because it's a government. It's because it's a wicked government. It's because it's an involuntary government. I don't see voluntary government as anything wrong.
Voluntary government is a contradiction. The thing is, you jumped right over the definition of government and went to governing in a very vague sort of wishy-washy thing that you could literally apply to anything. Like a person making a garden is governing the garden. Nobody calls a gardener a government of the garden. Government in the political sense is always an authoritarian ruling class. That's what it means, the exercise of authority. And authority isn't just about arrangement and cooperation. But again, whatever words you want to use to describe it, because you are actively arguing in favor of minarchism, which includes a government, and against anarchism, there must be some quality to what you advocate that doesn't fit inside the definition of anarchism. So far, everything you described is 100% compatible with anarchism and doesn't at all match the definition of government, which is an authoritarian ruling class.
So I've tried to tell people this before, that I've talked with anarchists who say, dude, you should just say you're an anarchist. But then I talk about this voluntary form of government and they say, that's evil, that's enslavement, and you're wrong, and you deserve to be hung. Even when I give it the label of anarchy, just because I talk about it, even if it's in a voluntary context. So that's a social stigma, right? The thing is, and I can get over that all day. If you say I'm an anarchist, believe me, if I have your name behind it, I'll be on cloud 9, right? That'll be easy. So government, going back to it, is the governing body of a nation, state, or community. Again, not necessarily by authority, not necessarily by force. That's just what the definition is. Now, we can go off of other definitions of government, but I am just purely going by dictionary definition. So I'm saying if I advocate that government by the dictionary definition, even if it could be voluntary, that suddenly I advocate some form of government. And so therefore I probably, can I be a minarchist and anarchist at the same time? Because if I believe in a little bit of voluntary government, then technically that makes me a minarchist. But if it's against your definition of government, then I guess that would make me an anarchist. Well, and I'll explain in a second why the semantics are important, but I need to give you a chance to answer that, I guess.
Okay, there's another big problem here. Aside from the why are you arguing against anarchism and then describing anarchism, just is a different word from government. It means minimal amount of rulers, not organization, not managing, not contractual thing. The arc in minarchist is authoritarian domination. That's what the word frickin' means. And anarchy means none of the authoritarian domination. So whatever you wanted to define government or governing to mean, or whatever definition you want to say we should use or shouldn't use, minarchy, arc is about ruling. That's what it's meant for thousands of years. To call yourself a minarchist means I just want a minimal amount of authoritarian ruling. And what's weird is what you just described is anarchy. It is no ruling. It is contractual arrangements and or lack thereof if people don't want to do that. What's fascinating to me, let me quick throw this in. What's fascinating to me is that I'm arguing against me. I wrote a thing in 1994 that described exactly what you described, and it was called The God Called Government, and it bashed almost everything about government, but insisted on a little purely defensive, voluntary, blah, 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 blah. And I could feel, like, retroactively, I could feel my desperation to hang on to the title government and the idea of government. And looking back, I had already gone past that. I was already an anarchist, but I wanted to hang on to the government. So let me put it this way. Why do you want it to be called government when people voluntarily contract with each other and make agreements?
I guess it's a lack of want, and more so just that I always felt like I was being true to the definition. Here's the other thing, and I guess this will get back onto it mattering, right, as far as a matter of semantics, is that I think that people can be able to volunteer to give someone else authority. Now, if they don't choose to do that themselves, I don't think you and I would choose to do it. I think very few would choose to do it. I think after we put these competitive governments in practice, the other government would lose all of its people because it's so few on human rights. But you can volunteer to say, hey, we all agree to give up these rights and give it to this guy. They could do that in a minarchist society. Now, could they do that in an anarchist society? I'm just genuinely, I don't know. But I think that they would be able to in a minarchist society so long as they knew what they were doing is voluntary. I think it'd be a bad idea, but they were still able to do it.
Well, any contract you can do, like, by definition, gives away some of your rights. Like, I will give you $1,000 if you give me that keyboard. I don't get to keep my $1,000 if you give me the keyboard. So
Sure.
Of course you can give away your rights by contract. The thing is, if you're like, that's not what arcing, that's not ruling, because if I make a contract with somebody and I say, I'll give you $1,000 if you give me that keyboard, neither of us became the ruler. We both voluntarily gave up some of our rights. Like, I'm giving up the money, they're giving up the keyboard. It's a voluntary arrangement. Which one of us would you call government in that arrangement? Because you seem to insist that anything that even vaguely fits that description is government. So which is it? Am I government because I'm buying his keyboard, or is he government because he's selling it to me?
I think in that situation, there's no actual ruler. What I'm suggesting, though, is another situation where you say, I'm going to vote for this guy, and this guy is going to rule over me and this group of people who also agree to have that guy rule over us. I think that makes that guy a ruler, because he decides what the rules are and gets to enforce them.
Well, if somebody, you can do that in a club or something. Like, here's the bar.
Yeah.
You can come in, you can be members of our club, but you don't, we all leave after 3 a.m. and no breaking the furniture. And you can have rules that you volunteered into. Is a bar a government? Again, how many things wouldn't you apply that label to in the literally thousands of different ways that people can organize and make contracts and make clubs and organizations, including with hierarchy and somebody like a football team? Okay, you're the captain, you call the plays. Do you call that government? Would you call yourself a minarchist because you believe in quarterbacks calling the plays?
So yeah, then this is kind of exactly what we're touching on. It's like that term, self-ownership, and people are saying, well, do you believe in self-ownership? I'm like, well, yeah, I do. Well, do you believe in ownership of somebody else by you? Well, I don't want that to happen, but do I believe it could happen? Yes, I believe I could submit to it. But the problem then the same problem comes up with governments. Do I believe in self-governance, self-government? Yes, I do. Do I believe that, yes, these little bars, even with one bar owner and 3 people can make a bunch of rights and enforce it by definition, because he's the governing body and the ruler, and anybody who goes to his bar submits to his rules. He seems like the government in that situation. Now, I'm not attached enough to the word to love it, but it's simply that I don't want to be caught in a catch-22 where somebody says, don't you know, technically you're advocating for government right now. And then I've misrepresented anarchy because I'm technically, you know what I'm saying? I'm technically advocating for a government, even if it is on a voluntary level.
Yeah, but you're not if you're talking about football teams and bars or people contracting for protection agencies or anything else. And that's why it's weird to me that if inside the system you described, I and a bunch of people can say, we're going to hire this guy to patrol our neighborhood at night, and we pay him, and it's all voluntary. And we agree that, we agree to pay him this much, and we agree to let him walk down the street in the middle of the night, and we won't interfere with him. We give up a few little rights. like, I wouldn't call that government because it isn't. Would you like insist that that is government if we voluntarily hired something? If I hired someone to do stuff like that?
So I'd be wrong to call myself a unifier, which is what I've always tried to be, if I were to say like hard yes or hard no on that. I'm not trying to force my words down somebody else's throat. I don't care if and I even told people going into this, I guess, debate or interrogation, you might find out I'm an anarchist. I told somebody minutes before this, I'm like, my guess is he's going to say that I'm an anarchist and that I'm just using the wrong term. And the thing is like, I've known that for a while because I've tried to explain that to people. But then when I talk about these voluntary systems, in fact, the exact situation you just described with the night watchman, they describe that as government. And so therefore I say, well, I guess technically it's governing. So I guess technically I'm not an anarchist. So I guess you're technically right. And so usually it's the anarchists that want me to not misrepresent them that way. And so they want me to not label myself as an anarchist because I am okay with that situation you just suggested.
Well, it may be that the main problem is you talk to too many commie boneheads who think that voluntary hierarchy is somehow magically automatically oppressive, when what's oppressive is telling people that they're not allowed to voluntarily do that. What you described is absolutely anarchism and absolutely doesn't fit the political definition of government, and definitely doesn't fit the definition of ARC, like a ruling class. Like, it's not a rule by a little bit of a ruling class if it's all consensual and it's all by contract and it's all voluntary and nobody's forced into it. That really is anarchism. So then it's just a matter of why call that because minarchism means the minimal amount required of ARC, as in ruling authoritarian domination, when it isn't that. And it may actually be, I just think you talk to too many commies who try to paint anything that even looks vaguely hierarchical or like puts limits on what people can do because they agreed that way. They're trying to label that all government. And I would say their definition of government is bogus, and your definition of government is bogus, and what you're actually advocating is called anarchism, or more specifically, voluntaryism, which, like, the whole point is everything's voluntary, nobody's coerced into any of these agreements or anything of this.
And I've always loved voluntarism. I've never managed to irritate that community so much as I always irritated the anarchists in the past. Now, here's the thing, because we talk about the boneheads, right? And yeah, sometimes it is me talking to these guys online. But the thing is in history, it's actually played out. When we talk, I talked about, Stirner and Godwin, and, you call them boneheads. And so I'll throw their arguments out the window. That's fine. Obviously, I don't have any love for them because I don't agree that decimating the family or not being able to participate in an orchestra together is somehow oppressive. But when we talk about anarchy in the past, when we look at a lot of them that have failed, whether you're looking at Jamaica in 1720, even Albania in 1997, the French and the English aftermath after those revolutions when they had these anarchist factions, the thing is they actually, in the majority of these cases, specifically outlawed that type of voluntarism. And so they said, you can come to these trades sometimes and these contractual arrangements, but one of the biggest issues that we have is we say you can't make if we want to call it a ruling class, you can't agree to make a ruling class, or you can't agree to make these people that enforce these rules for you. Oliver Cromwell in England was famous for this because he said, if we agree to it, and that's the only way to preserve this society right now, I don't consider that, some type of big government. And so he dealt with a lot of the problems I'm dealing with today because they called him a minarchist, right? They called him, he's just advocating big government. This same thing happened after the French Revolution to Armand II, right? And they actually exiled him, kicked him out of France. And he says, I know people are going to suddenly say that I'm like some big government lover, but all I'm saying is that we should voluntarily agree to put some defenses in place. And they cast him out. Right. So the thing is while I can say, this is just semantics and this is just arguing over Facebook, this actually has had historical and practical problems because people have illegalized the ability to organize and form some type of either be a defensive structure or even voluntary contract, because there has to be a ruler to enforce those contracts, even if those rulers are agreed upon by those people who are under that contract. So I guess that's the historical thing that I have with it, which is why, they got cast out in the past. So that's why I guess I don't necessarily put myself in the anarchist group yet, unless you think I should.
Yeah, well, I totally think you should, and stop like give up the desire to stick the government label on that. A couple things in there that you mentioned in passing that I'll quick touch on, and then I think we're almost done anyway. And then I guess we still have time, so you could ask me whatever you wanted. But because I do think you're just an anarchist desperately trying to stick the label of government where it doesn't belong. One quick thing is, and I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this, but rather than just putting words in your mouth, I'll put it in the form of a question. Do you think that whether or not something has prevailed and happened and, been, continuous determines whether it's moral or not?
No, absolutely not. The founding fathers were really good about looking at, and again, the founding fathers weren't perfect either, before everybody blows up at me. But they looked really heavily at what the fall of Rome and the whole Roman Empire. And they said, look, this has been like the most successful recent empire as a matter of longevity. So what we need to do is look at what made the longevity part, because that part's okay. We want something that outlives us when we're gone, but we don't want to do those evil, wicked things that they were doing that helped keep them around. So no, I absolutely reject that just by virtue of it being a successful model, that it being a moral model. And you can probably find a lot of business examples of that as well as political ones.
Right. And I bring that up because when people say, show me an example of where anarchy has worked, it's like back in the slave days saying, well, the abolitionists are wrong because slavery keeps happening. No, they're not. Even if it kept happening forever, they're still the only ones advocating the moral position. So there was that little thing in passing, but we're in agreement on that just because it's what is doesn't mean it's what should be. As far as because what you advocate has no territory unless people it only applies to the people and the places or the people and their property that decide to be controlled by it. Would you also concede that even using your definition of government, which I think is sort of the crux and the problem of it, that if lots of people say, I'm not making a deal with any of those, I don't want to contract with any of the things you're calling government, and because you've already said you can't force them to, that is anarchy too. In other words, aren't you advocating minarchism for the people who actually want to do that and anarchism for the people who don't?
I would say that's the perfect way to describe it. Yes. Minarchy for the people who decide to live under it, and anarchy for the people who don't. Yeah, I would say you hit the nail on the head with that description.
And I think that necessarily makes it not actually constitute political government and not actually constitute ARC, as in anarchy or monarchy. But then that's just the semantic thing, and we've sort of covered that. So I guess I'm done. I declare you to be an anarchist, and you need to listen to more Tommy Boneheads and more voluntarists. If you want to ask anything in the other direction, I think we're almost on the same page on everything except for terminology and a couple of distinctions.
Well, and I can let that go. And I want you to understand, I have no love of these terms. I don't, and I know you're saying, you're insisting that I put the government label on it. I don't like that. It's just that people will technically get me on it if I say it. And so I'm like, all right, government by definition or whatever it may be. But I mean, I'm fine. I'll come out and I'm already planning on Facebook to being like, Larkin Rose says I'm an anarchist. So y'all sending me the death threats, leave me alone because he says I'm chill. But there is something that I wanted to ask you on, because I think it's a matter of practice, and people have said that this has made me an anarchist before. Now, this is purely a social construct. So this is not at all, I'm not even going definitions on this. I just want to see what you think. That before in the past, because I do a lot of activism, we do a lot of work here in Salt Lake City. We actually got the police to embrace de-escalation techniques, and it's resulted so the police haven't killed anybody since 2015. There's a lot of problems with it. all involuntary, funded incorrectly, drug war, all that is still going on, right? And so I'm not advocating for any of that at all. But for me, I consider it a practical step, at least in the right direction. Now, you could disagree that this is a step in the right direction. For me, I say that that encouraging those techniques is at least saving some lives maybe in the meantime. Now, maybe the whole system collapses. However we get to anarchy, we get to anarchy. But would you say I'm wrong to insist on necessarily the police doing this, like just disbanding all one day and letting us live in anarchy? Would you say I'm wrong to use the system to decrease the size, scope, and damage that the police do in the meantime?
Well, I would sort of compare that to, like, if you're in a place that still has over, slavery, someone going to the slave masters and saying, we know you're not going to let them go. We think it's immoral that you do this at all and treat them like property. However, we did this study that demonstrates that you'll actually get more productivity out of them if you beat them less. Is that any closer to freedom? Nope. Does it reduce the amount of, day-to-day oppression and violence? It could. So I'm not against that in conceptually, even though obviously slavery is totally evil start to finish. The thing is, if, things that try to nudge authoritarians in the direction of being less buttheads is not what I'm against. Putting an authoritarian on a throne and saying he won't be as bad as the other one is what I'm against, because it involves putting an authoritarian on the throne, like trying to empower someone will oppress other people. That's not okay. So I would say, like, it's not okay to, we're going to take these slaves and give them to some other slave owner because he's nicer. Like, in their day-to-day lives, that may make things a little bit easier. It actually just legitimizes slavery, and it doesn't get them any closer to actual freedom, even if on a practical basis they suffer a little bit less. So I'm not opposed to, like, trying to do things to make cops be less sadistic psychos and things like that, but things that actually empower anybody. If the excuse is, well, it would have been worse the other way without them, that's how you get freaking Donald Trump. There's a bunch of people that think, well, Hillary would have been even worse. And by the way, that's also how you would get Hillary, by people saying Donald Trump would be even worse. Either way, we would have got a complete psycho from people voting them in because they were scared of the other one. So
sure, no disagreements there.
Okay, but if there are tricks and ways to, or nice ways to persuade, control freaks to be less fascist, okay, I mean, it's not a step closer to having an actual free society, but if it reduces suffering, okay, I'm okay with that.
Sure, and maybe what I'm asking is, I think it's okay to, you and I both agree if you need to remove cancer, let's get some surgery done. But if there's also some pain relief techniques in the meantime, I'm not advocating that as the solution, but at least something we can do in the meantime before it gets there. I think that, and I don't think that you'd mind, but like I said, I've been told that's one of the things before that makes me not an anarchist, is because I'm willing to discuss this with the police. And yes, I know it comes across as, please don't beat me so much. And maybe that is what it is. But if I get it across and it saves lives, for me personally, I have a tough time not doing it. I'm okay with not making other people join me in doing that. But would you say that that's something that means I can't be an anarchist, but I can still do those things at the same time? No, it's funny because I just posted a thing that the first glance doesn't look like it's about this, but it totally relates to what you just said, because some people say, you're not really an anarchist if you use money or have a driver's license or have a carry permit or have a passport or use their money or all these things. And I was pointing out that, like, massively inconveniencing yourself is not a prerequisite for opposing statism. Like, it's like if a carjacker is pointing a gun at you, you might want to give him your car keys. Doesn't mean you're pro carjacking. It means you're pro not being dead in it. Right.
So if there are things that whether it's preserving your own, I'm going to go along with this cop right now because he's a rabid dog and I don't want him to kill me, or trying to do things that make him nicer to other people, I'm okay with that. That doesn't necessarily have to be legitimizing authoritarian domination to try to make the people in those positions be nicer. So I would say, the people who, if anybody's pretending that you're not an anarchist because you're telling cops to please not be such buttheads, that doesn't make you not an anarchist. If you advocate I just want you to rob fewer people. I want you to rob them, and I want you to throw them in cages for this, and this, but not for that. Then you are a statist. But if you're trying to get them to be nicer without condoning any violent aggression, then that's fine. There's nothing that doesn't make you not an anarchist.
Right. And to clarify, if I take a few things, I'm not giving them anything, but if I take things off of their table that they can currently victimize, that's okay too, right?
Yeah. Again, it's treating a symptom and trying to, in the short term, reduce the suffering doesn't fix the underlying problem, which is the belief in the right to rule. But yeah, I'm okay with treating symptoms to try to do that if you're not doing it in a way that actually empowers authoritarianism, but just in a way that takes away the powers, which is why I don't mind it when people vote on like referendums against a particular new stupid authoritarian idea, because that's 100% against authoritarian control. You're not like, I'm going to put this guy on the throne instead. It's just, I want nobody to do that particular evil, stupid thing, so I'm going to vote against that. It still doesn't work very often, and the courts throw it out and all that. But it's not, I don't have the same objection to that as I do with somebody trying to put somebody on the throne who they promises will be a nicer slave master, because that's still putting them on the throne.
It's funny because when we had that debate last time about the voting, all I was trying to get across, and I didn't even pose the question, you volunteered it, that you said, well, yeah, we should still, be against referendums or for referendums that take away these powers and limit the amount of suffering. And I was like, oh, crud, that's all I was really trying to get across with the voting. So you took away literally 95% of my notes straight out the window, because that's what I was. And then it was so after that, there's really only voting on representation, which I'm not keen on unless it's voluntary. So I used other anarchist point of view and stuff just so that I could try to have some semblance of an argument to get my point across. But I was like, yeah, that's the way he just said the way that I advocate voting as well. So I was like, well, I guess I don't know what the point of me being here is, but that was kind of my point. So let's wrap this up with something that I wanted to ask you, because I think that this is something that a lot of anarchists struggle with. And if I'm going to embrace the label, like I'd like to, that something that I would want to ask is how do we stop? How do we show, I guess I shouldn't say stop, because I know how it would stop, but how do we stop correlating this anarchy with what basically ultimately almost immediately turns into feudalism? Now, I know a lot of this has been because of refusal to embrace any kind of rulership or rules, because they keep insisting on no rules, and then someone says, oh, I'll make the rules for you, and then becomes that authority. How do you think the best way is to convince people, with all the history that we have, that we can change that history going forward? Because I know the moral argument, and I'm completely with you on that. But as far as overcoming the history, how do you think we go about that?
Well, on the two things to do away with feudalism, there's two parts to it. One already happened, which is the advent of the firearm. The other one is doing away with the belief in authority. And this, we could get into another whole huge discussion about arguing about predictions. The likelihood of any feudal lord ruling class oppressing 100 million well-armed American gun owners, which is what there is right now, is none. If they didn't have the belief in an obligation to obey, and even just have what they have now, there would be no feudalism. Because the first person to say, I'm in charge of you, is then a dead person, and the second person would go, I'm not going to do that. And it has nothing to do with there not being nasty people in the world. It has to do with the fact that if there's a big enough deterrent, the nasty people find some other way to try to make money, maybe even a voluntary way, because their other option is to get a bullet in the head. So I think the belief is often when people talk about this, they hugely underestimate how much the belief in authority matters, and the fact that if you got, like I've said before, if China tried to come and take over the U.S., which they're not going to, and they don't have the means to anyway, but if somebody tried to come do to the American people what Congress already does on a daily basis, without the people recognizing them as a legitimate authority, it would last for about 5 minutes, and then they'd all be slaughtered and be dead. It only works now because people have been trained over their lifetime to believe, no, this is the U.S. government and they represent us, and yada, 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 all the mythology that try to make it look legitimate. Without a belief in the legitimacy of that supposed authority, nobody is controlling us. And nobody is controlling the world when, guns, now that guns make it a lot more playing field. Like a bunch of guys with swords, yeah, they did really well against people without swords. Against somebody with an AR-15, not so much.
Oh yeah, I think even the biggest government people I know on a personal basis would like personally agree to like 1% maybe of what the U.S. government does on a daily basis. But I mean, even 1% might be highballing it a bit. So yeah, I totally agree with you there. Well, I know that we're about to run out of time, and I'll let you have any last words that you want to get across. But for me, I just wanted to thank you for hosting this and for being civil about it. I really appreciate it. I'm really grateful to Patrick Smith once again for hosting this. This is awesome. He does a really good job with Distance Draw, and you should always check him out. He does awesome, and he's always been ready at the drop of a hat for us. But thanks for engaging me civilly. I really appreciate it. I'm happy to use the title and to spread that forward and hopefully change some hearts and minds.
Yeah. Well, I want to happily declare you to be an anarchist. However, I can't say I won you over because I think you already were. You're just trying to apply a label that I don't think really applies. But that was excellent. Thanks so much for coming on and answering the questions and having a nice civil exchange. And I do want to big up Patrick Smith, who takes time out of his busy day and uses his awesome equipment to keep doing these things, and for free, because he's awesome. I probably shouldn't say that, because now 1,000 people will ask him to do this. Just say no, say you're too busy. But thanks to everyone. It was awesome, and have a government-free day.